One of the things that I think is very important when it comes to self-determination is the fact that we tend to sometimes focus on too much of some parts of this subject and not about other aspects of this subject. And what do I mean by this? Well, one of the things I've noticed about many self-determination discussions is that a lot of them tend to focus on how can this person understand me the best? How do I come across to this person? One of the reasons why I made that whole point about drawing the line between being stuck up or spoiled is because one reality that people with autism have to live with, and this is luckily not as true today as it was 20 years ago when I was a kid diagnosed, is that sadly a lot of the behaviors that we commonly see in autism are associated in our culture as behaviors of people who are spoiled and stuck up. In fact, one metaphor I often use whenever I discuss this subject to teachers is the fact that there was a time when if you had autism, you were often mistaken as a Veruca Salt or a Dudley Dursley. Two literary examples, many of their behaviors actually mirror those with autism. Suppose, for example, Dudley Dursley had gotten the same number of presents every year. And for the first time, he got a different number of presents. While clearly the intent of that outburst is for Dudley to be stuck up, to demand his parents give him the same amount of presents, you could very plausibly attribute that behavior to a routine change and argue that Dudley was on the spectrum. As for Veruca, you could also have attributed that to a routine change too if her parents were truly constantly giving her a bunch of ponies. However, we sadly live in a world where a lot of behaviors that are a part of autism, which are in most cases not because they are spoiled or stuck up, come across that way. And therefore, if one really amazing way to demonstrate this also appears in our cinema. Who here has ever seen the movie Elf before? Anyone remember Elf? Anyone remember all the social situations he found himself in New York City? How many times people thought of Buddy the Elf as bad? The negativity that he created, even though everyone who saw that movie knew he was just an innocent elf from the North Pole who didn't understand social norms. The problem wasn't that Buddy the Elf was a bad person. It's just that in our society, we live in a world that associates certain behaviors with certain temperaments and with certain qualities. We associate some behaviors as good behaviors and some behaviors as bad behaviors. And it just so happened that many behaviors that Elf engaged in, we as a society associate. You can't speak up for everything. And there are some things that you are not able to speak up for. And one thing that often amazes me is that a lot of teachers and professionals who understand that one core social deficit of autism is the inability to understand how social rules are different in social contexts. Those same teachers will just flat out tell a teenager with autism, speak up for yourself, without even giving any awareness to what the rules and limitations are and the different contexts in which you can or can't speak up for yourself in. I mean, what often amazed me, I actually took a class in high school called self-determination. What amazed me was there was so much emphasis on us learning how to defend our needs by teachers who ostensibly understood that we can't, being autistic, naturally understand how these are different in different contexts, without even really telling us how those rules differ in different places and what you can and cannot fight for. And one thing I had to learn when I went out into the community, when I went out to travel as a speaker after finishing high school, is that there are many unwritten rules regarding unwritten rules and nuances of the social skills you're teaching about, much better than those you are teaching. And with self-determination, it can be very hard. If you instinctively understand when you say to your students, self-determinate, and you understand automatically what the rules are, but they don't. It's very common, in fact, for many people with autism to not be able to take sarcasm. I can tell you right now that one of the reasons why that inability to take sarcasm exists is because many people with autism have been in situations where sometimes things that are sarcastic among non-autistic people haven't always been sarcastic when you are a person with autism. For example, if you've been rejected and thrown out of groups, if you have to live in a world where you might get thrown out of a location by security because you didn't follow some unwritten social rule that no one told you and everyone expected you to know, telling a person with autism sarcastically something like that, they're going to believe it. Because most people with autism have been in times where some security officer told them, you need to leave the premises, and they thought it was sarcastic and got in more trouble because they thought the security guard was joking. The fact is, being unable to understand how social rules are different is a very serious issue. And so I say this to any teacher who's listening to this right now. If you're going to teach self-determination, you can't just stop there. You have to teach the basic rules and nuances. And here's basically where I would propose we start. You're in cannot meet them. Not every place is legally entitled to meet your needs. Some places are. Some places are not. Michael John Carley, a self-advocate with autism, discusses this phenomenon regarding employment. He has written in several of his books. The ADA only protects you in employment to the extent that you can perform the essential functions of a job. If you cannot perform the essential functions of a job because of needs that you have, you can still be fired. And I can tell you honestly, there was a career path I had to abandon because I discovered I had a need that career path was never going to meet. And I had to accept abandoning that career path. I had to accept that there was no way that need was going to get accommodated. And so what I basically am going to say here is, know when you're speaking up for yourself, what is the legal requirement for them accommodating you? If it's employment, you have to be able to perform the functions of the job, and if they're giving you accommodations, you have to show that you can perform those functions. Now, some places are legally required to accommodate certain needs, like many public facilities like public transportation. Throughout my educational career, a limitation slowly emerged that did not disappear as I got older. Although I am very capable of functioning in sustained loud environments, like, say, a loud city street where there's sustained loud noise, sound and loud noises can be very painful for me. And no matter how old I was, whether it was in grade school or high school, the mandatory fire drills in our schools have always been very traumatic for me. And my body was basically telling me in high school that I wouldn't be able to handle an entire professional career with fire drills. So I had to abandon that path. I realized that having to deal with the loud noise of a fire alarm for the next 40, 50 years of my working life was going to be too much for me. I realized that in that case, speaking up for myself, being self-determined, wasn't going to involve trying to fight this struggle I had with fire drills and pursue this career. What it really meant was I had to walk away from it. One other thing that we also have to be teaching people with autism is that when you have to fight, when you are fighting for the right to partake in something, you can't fight for the right to be included everywhere. So many people with autism grow up with teachers who speak so much about inclusion. But inclusion doesn't work everywhere. The reality is we live in a world that has to sometimes exclude. And what I say is, here's another thing we have to teach. When you are fighting to be included, you can only fight for the right to be included in a social setting where you have the right to be there if you are not autistic and have the same to speak up for is helping others find people who are familiar with an activity they are entitled to partake in to help them understand those rules. Because one reality I have to live with, what a lot of people with autism have to live with, is that we're often unfairly excluded from places because we don't understand unwritten social rules instinctively that others expect us to know. Every social setting that I have succeeded in was not because I learned social skills better than other kids with autism in a social skills group. It was not because I happened to comprehend the lists of social rules from a social skills workbook by a school social worker, or by following proper behavior, and would very respectfully tell me, if you want to be a part of this activity, do you have a legal right to be a part in that activity? And if so, what are those social rules? Why do I say legal right? Because there are many activities that restrict themselves to certain people. Probably a very classic local example which really demonstrates those self-determination limitations. I know many people in this room are very familiar with this. Who here has been to the Autism Society of Wisconsin State Conference? Well, longtime attendees of that conference might be familiar with that fact that during one of the nights of the conference we have a pizza dinner, a talent show, and a dance. What longtime attendees also, I have met those males with autism at that conference. They believe, in the name of self-determination, that they have the right to fight for inclusion at that event. And I have had to explain to them that because the rule says this event is only open to females, that regardless of how self-determined they are, because no male has the right to participate in that event, they do not have the right to fight to partake in that event. However, if a female with autism wanted to partake and just needed some social assistance, they could speak up for themselves because they would have the right to partake. But that's one thing, in my opinion, is often overlooked when we teach self-determination. We don't teach a lot of people with autism, if you can't be a that also has to be remembered too, is that not only does self-determination entail you speaking up for yourself, it's the fact that since you're talking to other people, they have the right to speak up to you as well. You can focus solely on what you are doing to speak up for yourself, but often ignore the fact that if people are going to be self-determined, there are going to be times when people are going to speak up to yourself, to you as well. How do you respond to that? How can we teach people with autism how to properly respond when they're the ones that are being spoken to? Time when we didn't do something that upset each other. It's because we were able to speak up for ourselves when we needed to. It's because we were comfortable enough to be able to sit down and talk to each other when we needed to and make a resolution. Even sometimes when those resolutions necessitated bringing up a sensitive subject or something that some people might find inappropriate. I have a friend, for example, who has autism, has a very sensitive smell. Sense of smell. Their sense of smell is so sensitive that we had to confront the fact that no matter how hard I would try to bathe or shower before seeing them, I could still make them uncomfortable because of that sensitivity. We actually picked a perfume, a scent that didn't bother them, and we made an agreement that I would wear that perfume before we ever hung out. That has to be met. Yet, you are in an environment that has deemed it inappropriate to talk about that need. That's another question that needs to be answered. That's another thing we need to teach. I was once at an autism convention with a friend with autism who had a very personal need. I will not share that need out of respect for that person. The problem, though, was that that need had to be addressed. It got in the way of that person being able to function independently in that event. They needed assistance. The problem, though, is that that need could not be openly discussed freely. This individual could not just openly say, when your typical high school kid engages in adolescent rebellion or wants to create that identity, they almost always do so within the context of a group. Whether it's, you can call it a clique, you can call it a gang, you can call it a posse. And I'll tell you, one of the most confusing things I dealt with in high school was I saw all these kids engaging in rebellion against norms, and here I was, the person with autism, not understanding this type of rebellion while I resented a lot of social norms. What I realized was that groups give people power to challenge social norms when they need to, through the power of the fact that a group creates a social situation where if people have mutual... it's funny. Tim talked about my foray into the National Hobo Convention. At the National Hobo Convention every year, there are sometimes groups who proclaim themselves anarchists. I actually, just to prove a point, tried to join this one group of anarchists, and they kicked me out. Seems crazy, but you know what? It turns out, although these groups pretended to be lawless anarchists, they had a series of unwritten social rules that I violated. And the amazing thing was, no matter how much they believed in anarchy, they still had the same rules anyone else had. If you don't follow the rules of our group, you're out. Now, I have to admit, trying to test their anarchy, there were some things that probably I shouldn't have done. But I really had proved my point that even a group of social rules are just rules that I cannot work with. There are some that are. But the one defining factor is someone willing to sit me down and teach me those rules? Or is there an expectation that I'm going to have the ability to learn them? Now, there's a person in this audience that I want to introduce. And if you're in another place, you will not be able to see this person. This person's name is Eric. And Eric and I work at several anime conventions together. And when I work at anime conventions, I host presentations about autism to teach attendees at anime conventions about autism. And I do so because a lot of people with autism go to anime conventions. But one of the things that brought me to the anime convention scene is the fact that anime conventions, in my experience, have an understanding of the fact that people need to have that assistance when understanding those social rules. And what I like about anime conventions is how when you register for an anime convention, it was also helpful so you could promote GeekCon too.
Okay. That's where you're going. So, like James said, we both work numerous anime conventions. Shameless plug for GeekCon here. Yeah, I didn't plan this. With anime conventions, the other side is not just like the autism community itself is. A lot of anime fans are excluded too because they like that kiddie cartoon stuff. When in all reality, depending on the show, believe me, it's not for kids.
Yeah.
Anyone that's seen Samurai 7 knows that one. But the other side of it, like he said, with all the, quote, social rules we have to follow, is they're usually on either page 1 or page 2, first thing you see, and they're listed out in numerical order. And for anyone that needs assistance with anything, we have a place called Convention Operations, which is like the resource room in high schools, where you can go and be like, okay, I need assistance with this, or I need assistance with this. And the goal of that is to make sure everybody is included. Like, I know there are some anime conventions out there that have actually started hiring sign language interpreters for people that need that assistance that are hard of hearing. Or a lot of conventions now have dedicated people for someone like James and I with autism to walk them through the hallways or to make sure that they're okay.
That so many high school teachers are hoping their high school students will eventually learn and master.
Heck, for example, when I was in high school, my resource room person was an anime fan. I ran into him at GeekCon 2 years after high school, just completely out of the blue. And we sat and talked for a little bit and did the whole, hey, how's life going for you, yada, yada, yada spiel. Because the other side of it for anime conventions was I found a place where I didn't feel out of the ordinary. And it helped me kind of a little bit more accept those, quote, social norms. And it gave me a place where I felt at home within my own community, basically.
Thank you for sharing, and I hope that encounter was better than encountering Mr. Corrado at the club in the Sleepover film, if you remember that movie. And remember that movie Sleepover?
You're going to give me nightmares here, dude.
It's actually a really nice movie that teaches awareness of a lot of the social issues that middle school kids face. So
We do have the Is My Roommate Dead stick, though, from No Brand Con.
a lot of adults with autism have been judged negatively for going to a playground and playing, even though emotionally they still want to play on the playground. Anime conventions have given a safe place for these adults with autism, most of which they're not bad people, they're not really creepy people, they just are emotionally at a different age than they are chronologically, can express that interest and not be thought of as weird or creepy. Because anime conventions have done so much that a lot of teachers often aspire to, that's why I wanted to share and promote what conventions like GeekCon are doing. Anyone who wants to learn more about how anime conventions are helping people with autism, with self-determination, other skills, you can actually go on GeekCon's website, geekcon.12. And I'm not trying to promote this necessarily for people to go to the convention, but I'm trying to promote how this convention has helped people with autism self-determinate as a model that teachers can look at to understand personal space boundaries. That's why I'm promoting this.
And the rule with cosplay is not consent is not just consent to, quote, touch them. It's also, can I take your picture? Can I give you a hug? And heck, you've seen these. The people that walk around with big cardboard sides that say, free hugs.
Now, I do not know what your views are on this, but I actually think I actually support that.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Because what is really nice at anime conventions is people will put on signs that say free hugs so that people who do hug, and a lot of the people who have issues with personal space, then know who they can freely hug and who to stay away from. Basically, it's an accommodation where if you're one of those people with autism who have a hard time knowing not to invade people's space, the free hug system is a system to make sure that those people know who they can hug and who they can't. In fact, a lot of the people who put those signs on are people who enjoy hugging who put that sign on so they can accommodate that deficit of theirs. Thank you for sharing, Eric.
You're welcome. Can I go sit down now?
Yes. Okay. I didn't know what I was doing.
Okay. And if not, if there's no questions, then I'll just read from the 25 easy rules of Comic-Con etiquette, which is friggin' hilarious.
Definitely.
Oh, they get wacky.
Oh my god,
Yeah.
I love this.
And I'm glad you understand that this promotion was not entirely commercial, but actually to make a point about self-determination.
Yeah, some of the social rules that are out there are fantastic. Yeah. I mean, some of them are like stay hydrated.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fantastic. I love that one. Along with the number 4, complaining about lines will not make them go faster. Why? Utu the Watcher will notice your griping and whisk you away to a 99.9% identical parallel dimension where every line is 5 minutes longer.
And you know, one of the interesting things, too, is that a lot of these rules, Comic-Cons used to not always place them, and anime conventions actually were the leaders who told Comic-Cons, hey, you'd better be putting your etiquette on your websites, too.
Yeah.
When I'm at an anime convention and I'm befriending some who's female, I always ask how old they are so I know whether or not they're over or under 18. And in fact, at many anime conventions, you are expected to, so you know exactly what the different boundaries are based on who you're talking to. In fact, the fact that I had to do something there that was absolutely prohibited in many other settings really taught me a lot about social context.
Oh.
A lot of conventions now actually have different badges between the age groups for that reason.
So a lot of conventions, what Eric was saying was a lot of conventions now have different badges for the different age groups, so it's easier to differentiate because it can be confusing. I mean, I know I look 20, but I'm not. And so I know some people get confused by this.
Yeah.
So, I'm like James's younger brother. And so I would have to wear a badge to make sure that people would know how old I am. But just to follow up on what you were saying is I looked up some more, and so I'm thinking about school and how we teach, proper behavior in school. Well, how about this? Don't take pictures of cosplayers without asking. Well, don't take pictures of anyone without asking. Stop all this, stop it.
There's actually this really great social comment.
Free hug signs don't equal free grope signs. Like that one. Don't randomly hug, grab, or touch people. That's a universal rule. Don't be too pushy, unsure, ask first. Those are great rules for life.
Yes.
Not just anime conventions, not just for people on the spectrum, but for all of us to be able to get along in a social setting. Those are some of the key rules.
And one of the reasons why I am so enthusiastic about this environment when I go to autism things is I'm trying to promote how these places teach people these rules for life.
Yeah.
How people with autism learn these rules for life, and how teachers and educators can implement what they're doing to teach people and how they can implement this in their schools.
Excellent. Are there any questions from the room for James? Not for me, for James.
I have one.
And we'll repeat it for the group.
James, you do so much traveling. You are probably the most self-reliant person, self-advocate that I know. What would you say are the three top things that you do to...
You learn very easily that while it looks like you're self-reliant, you aren't. In fact, everyone...
Excuse me, I have to get the phone.
Everyone, to some extent, is not self-reliant. Everybody depends on something to get by. It's not always a group of people. But the fact is, think about this. Everyone has to have money to pay for their necessities. The way most people get that money is through work. You're dependent on an employer paying you so you can have enough money for your necessities. If you lost your job, you wouldn't be able to be as self-reliant. Everyone depends on something, whether it's dependent on money from their work, whether it's a group of friends that help them if they can't afford something. So the key to my ability to travel isn't self-reliance, it's the ability to, you have to respond to no exceptions. Some authority you have to respond to, but you can find ways to negotiate with that authority. Here are two different examples. I was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, attending an event. Due to a computer error, money that I had purchased to put on my Milwaukee bus card did not go on the card. I got on a bus, swiped my card. The computer said it was empty, and I had no cash with me. It didn't matter how much money I'd spent. The fact is that the bus driver was going to have to ask me to leave the bus, and I was going to have to listen to the bus driver's authority to have me leave the bus, because as far as the bus driver was concerned, I didn't have money to pay for the bus. On my ticket, on my bus pass, why did it not appear? I didn't just have to passively say, oh, your money's gone. I could work with them to figure out what happened. The good news is I was able to and the situation was resolved. What I've had to learn is knowing how do you respond to different figures of authority. Oh, and I will tell you honestly, I've never been arrested, but I've had many encounters with law enforcement on the road. There have been many situations where law enforcement has misunderstood a situation I was in, or just had to make sure a situation I was in was legitimate. In every case, it was never because of illegal activity, but I had to learn how to interact with law enforcement so I could help them understand that the situation they were seeing was a legitimate situation. And what I have to admire are cops in my community who when I had an encounter with them, my parents and I actually went to our local community police and introduced me to. I would sometimes have situations where I would be out in the community hanging out with my other friends from high school, and people would think that I was actually not in high school and older, and would complain that an adult was hanging out with high school kids. When the law enforcement found out that I was in high school, and in fact in one case, the kids my friends were hanging out with, were actually protecting me from some actual criminals in my high school who were trying to actually set me up to do stuff that was illegal. When the law enforcement realized that this group that people were misunderstanding was actually a support system that was protecting me from some really bad kids, one of which did end up going to jail, they vowed to protect me. And they have, and they did for the rest of my high school career. So that's another thing that I learned. It's knowing how do you properly engage different authority figures, because it's not just the same for everybody. And third, what are the stakes are high for me? If I have to maintain good terms with this one person, I'm going to work my butt off to make sure I don't alienate myself from that person. Like if someone gives me a place to stay when I travel, I work my butt off to ensure that I am on my best behavior as much as I possibly can. Even though it doesn't always appear that way, internally I'm working my butt off. But let's say I'm at a convention with a bunch of people who I only see a few times a year. They've never put me up. They've never helped me. We just see each other at conventions. Then there's not really as much stakes if I lose good terms with them. And one thing I've had to learn is, who are the people I really need to be on good terms with? I have to thank, in fact, my high school experiences for teaching me that. One thing I actually learned is that if I wanted to join a group